A suggestion I see a lot when the topic of the London Overground's Liberty line crops up is, wouldn't it make sense to make that a part of the Elizabeth line? The Liberty line, if you didn't know and you didn't watch my recent video about that line, is a short overground line that runs from Romford to Upminster. It has one intermediate stop at Emerson Park. The Elizabeth line also goes to Romford, as does Greater Anglia. At Upminster, the Liberty line meets the District line of the Underground and the C2C line to Southend. Basically, the purpose of the line these days is to connect two fairly important stations. But it seems like such an odd little line. It's only a couple of miles long, the train service is once every half hour, it only has one station to call its own. For many local journeys, to be honest, you'd be better off getting the bus. It's not even connected to any other overground line, and this has led many train fans to wonder if it would make sense to add it on to another service to make the most of its potential. Well, the first thing to point out is that initially the line did not only go between Romford and Upminster. Well, the line did, but the trains did not. Up until the mid-1950s, trains ran beyond Upminster to Grays. In the early years, there were trains all the way to Fenchurch Street and through to Tilbury. Now, the thing about all these train services is that they kept going at the Upminster end. There were no trains beyond Romford, and that is due to a bit of railway politics. The line through Romford was built by the Great Eastern Railway, and the line through Upminster was built by the London, Tilbury and Southend Railway. These two companies had a bit of an odd relationship. I wouldn't call it antagonistic, per se. In fact, one of the Great Eastern's predecessor companies, the Eastern Counties Railway, had been involved in the London, Tilbury and Southend Railway's creation. But at the same time, the Great Eastern seemed to view them as a bit of a threat. They tended to get a bit sus towards anyone muscling in on their turf, even though the Tilbury boys weren't so much muscling in as politely asking. The line we now call the Liberty line was a branch off the London, Tilbury and Southend that was supposed to connect with the Great Eastern. Both companies had access to some pretty useful and potentially lucrative destinations, so in theory this should have been a no-brainer. But the Great Eastern seemed to have feared the Tilbury boys stealing their traffic. They tried to get control of the new line, making it a condition of entering Romford Station that they should lease the new line. When the LTSR said no thank you, the Great Eastern simply refused to let them use Romford. So a separate station had to be built off to the side, which is why the Upminster platform is separate from the rest of the station. The reason I mention all this is because it partially explains why you can't add it to the Elizabeth line. The other problem you have is that the Elizabeth line comes in on the other side of the station. The Elizabeth line between Stratford and Shenfield uses the Great Eastern's old commuter line. The Great Eastern made much of their commuter trains for the simple reason that it was basically the only service they ran that was profitable. Therefore, they reworked their tracks out of Liverpool Street to allow the maximum number of commuter trains without interfering with their express services. What that meant, as I discussed in a recent video on why the Elizabeth line ends at Shenfield, was that they had two tracks purely for commuter services and two for everything else. These days, both sets of tracks are very intensively used. So that's the other problem. The Elizabeth line is so near and yet so far. To get between the Elizabeth tracks and the Liberty tracks, you have to cross the Greater Anglia tracks. Ideally, railway engineers prefer not to have tracks cross each other on the level because it complicates train movements. When you've got trains every few minutes, which you do at Romford, such a crossing would be a recipe for service disruption. Your other options are reroute one of the lines, which would be very expensive and very disruptive, if it could practically be done at all. I'm not an engineer. You would likely need to put a flyover in, like they did to extend the Suffragette line to Barking Riverside. But the service at Barking Riverside is 4 trains an hour, as compared to the Liberty line's 2 an hour. And Barking Riverside is envisaged as being an entire, fairly dense suburb. Much easier to justify the investment, especially when you've got the material support of the developers. But then we run into yet another practical problem. The Liberty line just isn't set up for Elizabeth line trains. In fact, it's officially classed as a rural line. The service consists of a single train shuttling up and down the line at half-hour intervals. The Elizabeth line, by contrast, has services from Romford approximately every 6 minutes at peak time. On the core section, though, this rises to one every 2.5 minutes. You really can't fit any more trains into the Elizabeth line timetable. Therefore, you would have to either have an Elizabeth line train that doesn't go all the way into London, which would seem to remove the main reason for adding the Liberty line to it, or you would have to remove trains from the timetable beyond Romford. I don't know what sort of effect that would have on commuter patterns. The service couldn't be very frequent because of the physical structure of the line. The Romford-Upminster line has always been a line for short, infrequent trains. It's a single track with no passing places. That means you can only really have one train at a time. The trains consist of Class 720/1 units, which are 4-coach trains. The small station at Emerson Park really isn't set up for anything larger, which is unfortunate because the Elizabeth line trains are 9-coach Class 345 units. Since you can't have 2 trains on the line without, again, rebuilding substantially, the frequency of service would need to be 2 Elizabeth trains an hour, with the effect that would have on the rest of that line's timetable. So with all that being said, the question is any of this really necessary? Because to be honest, a lot of the time the Liberty line is not very busy. 4 coaches are plenty for the number of passengers it gets. Maybe the passenger numbers would justify an Elizabeth line train at peak times, but I doubt it. They certainly wouldn't justify it during the day. Given the immense difficulty of setting everything up to get this concept to work, I just don't see it justifying the cost, in terms of the additional convenience to passengers. In conclusion, could the Liberty line be added to the Elizabeth line? Not easily. Should it be? Probably not. Well, I do hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, please do leave a like and consider subscribing for more. Are there any other connections you think the railways could do with but don't have? Sensible ones? Silly ones? Let me know in the comments section, and who knows, maybe they'll get videos of their own someday. I often get people asking about extra stations and extensions to the Elizabeth line, so the chances are that I'll be doing some of those in the future. I would like, as ever, to thank my donors on Ko-fi, on Patreon, and here on YouTube for your generous support. You are the flyover to my busy line. And I will see you all again very soon. Cheerio.